Hello to everyone. I hope you had a little bit of fun doing the preparatory reading, because we are talking today about satire as well, particularly the first two cases, which are about satire, caricature, and the question is, to what extent do you take it? Does satire in a way have special protection, immunity, etc.? I have also chosen the two first cases because they were quite similar in terms of the fact, but the outcome is quite different, which is always interesting when we look at case law through the perspective of comparative constitutional law. So we have two topics: offensive speech and blasphemous speech. Blasphemous speech will take us closer to the next sessions, which will be about freedom of religion, because it is speech related to religion and which offends people's religious feelings. Let's have a look first at offensive speech and at this case with Hustler magazine versus Falwell. You have seen the facts. So it's a caricature about a so-called televangelist. So he supports conservative politicians, obviously casts himself always as a very moral person, easily shocked, etc., defends traditional values, etc. And he was depicted in this article. You see, it's a parody with a Campari ad. And there's this play on what was Falwell's first time. What was his first time, according to the ad? What made him so outraged? Anyone? Yes. With his mom. He was drunk with his mom in the barn. Well, maybe you can imagine that he felt deeply shocked. What was also, I think, important to mention, there was a disclaimer. It's down here: ad parody not to be taken seriously. So there was a lawsuit brought against Hustler magazine. What did he sue for? Emotional distress, I think it's called. So basically saying that this publication caused me a lot of emotional suffering. Why did he not sue for example, defamation? Would that have been an option, do you think?
Not under the Sullivan doctrine, because he's a public figure. So it's unlikely that the court would award damages under...
So you say he's a public figure. Would that have been, and any other reason you would say? Because if you apply New York Times, you could still maybe get something, but you have to prove actual malice, etc. But there's another element, I think, which would be missing for a defamation suit.
Is it related to not being believable?
So when it's not believable, what is it then not? For defamation, it supposes what? It's a statement of fact, right? It's not always easy to know what is a fact, what is an opinion. I think I gave you the example. If you say, for example, my voice is unbearable, well, that's your opinion. But if you say that I corrupted someone to get my PhD, that would be a statement of fact. So here, well, we have a disclaimer. It's a parody. It's very unlikely anyone would believe that this is actually a factual statement. So this is why the lawsuit was not based on defamation. And the question then arises basically, what is the court's approach? You have on the one hand emotional distress of the person, on the other hand freedom of expression. You could say there's a conflict certainly of interests. How does the court solve this tension? Imagine you have to write a legal opinion on, we have another caricature of a public figure which someone could consider offensive. I'll give you some examples. You've been hired by the current president of the US. Emotional distress. I'm being shown here as a pig, etc. You're his legal team. What are, legally speaking, the chances, you would say, after Hustler magazine you get something? I reduced you all to silence. Are you too shocked? This is what you'll be doing as lawyers as well, often writing legal opinions, evaluating if you have a chance in bringing a case, etc.
A similar argument as the one posed in Stau's caricature case under German law could be that such a cartoon is intended to degrade his human dignity, and it has no other political purpose or serious debate purpose.
So you're saying one line of argument is to say this is basically here, it's not really a political debate, and well, it's just here to degrade the person. Do you think the US Supreme Court, I can understand the line of argument, very relevant in Germany. Would it fly in the US, do you think?
I guess not, because the US Supreme Court said that caricatures, it's just the nature of caricatures that they can be hurtful, and that this is also a valid argument they made for the public debate, and also that criticism of public figures doesn't have to be moderate or somehow reasoned.
So you say it didn't really fly, that argument, right? And then it's interesting to see how did the US Supreme Court motivate the fact to say, well, you know, you can get away with this. And you said this is not a great political caricature. It's not, well, he's not really a politician. It's just to make fun of him. Right? There was someone else raising their hand, or did I have a hallucination? I don't know. No, over there. So when we look at the reasoning, you mentioned also that the public debate is important. You have to be able to even critically, be very critical and so on. If you read the case, we also talked in this class about the foundational values of freedom of expression. The court refers, in my view, quite a bit in this case to these foundational values. What would they be? What have you found in this case? When we talk about political debate, etc., public figures.
I think somewhere the court says there is no wrong idea or something like this, and this could be traced back to this whole truth finding through different opinions, ideas.
So you have quite a few references in the case to truth, to the marketplace of ideas. And also this statement, there is no such thing as a false idea. I think you can link it to Mill saying, well, okay, you know, if there's wrong ideas, no one is infallible. Who knows what the true idea is? So we should have a discussion. And often people have, by the way, partial views. The truth may emerge. When you look at the case, for example, it's also quite typical that there will be a lot of reference. It's a novel question, but you will try to show that there are precedents. There is, for example, already on page 198, the court talks about the quest for truth and the vitality of society as a whole. And it's the paragraph starting with 49. First of all, the court refers also to another interest. We mentioned truth. The other one, public interest, the free flow of ideas and opinions on matter of public interest and concern is at the heart of the First Amendment. I would say that's the argument from democracy. Then always on page 198, it's in the right-hand column, you can see a reference to Holmes' competition of the market. The marketplace of ideas is well alive here. Then we have a reference to the robust political debate, etc. And on page 199, the court again refers to the truth-seeking function of the marketplace of ideas, even though it says that false statements of facts are not valuable per se. But why are they protected then? We don't have factual statements here. So here we have a reference to New York Times, the chilling effect, etc. And also, again, page 199, we have a quote, "Debate on public issues will not be uninhibited if the speaker must run the risk that it will be proved in court that he spoke out of hatred." So the motive doesn't matter, and even such speech can contribute to the truth. So I would say it's really a lot of references to this argument from truth and democracy. The court even goes as far as saying, it's on page 201, basically the fact that society may find speech offensive is not a sufficient reason for suppressing it. Indeed, if it's the speaker's opinion that gives offense, that consequence is a reason for according it constitutional protection. Do you agree? The fact that it's offensive is a reason for protecting it and not for limiting the speech? You agree?
Yeah, but just because a speech may be found offensive, it doesn't give you the right to suppress it.
So there we could link it to Handyside of the European Court, that freedom of expression also protects statements which offend, shock, and disturb, and the rationale being always that it's generally also not the mainstream which needs protection. And if you don't have mainstream views, well, you're likely to offend somebody or to shock someone, etc. And also, I think the other aspect is that people, if you want your speech to be effective, depending on which setting you're in, you sometimes have to exaggerate a bit, you have to add some color, etc.
Kind of like adding to this rationale that this cartoonist, after the Civil War, went beyond the bounds of decency, essentially, to criticize, to basically overwhelmingly attack corrupt public officials, and the court attributes this excessive critique to him going beyond the bounds of decency, essentially.
It's this cartoon, I think, which is mentioned, Nash, when the court basically says that the political cartoonists have made important contributions in the past and referred to Thomas Nast. And I looked it up, I was curious. So he did you said it was about a corrupt politician in New York who at the time was extremely rich and got a lot of money also, I would say, through patronage, etc. He had a fortune which nowadays would be about $1 billion. And he did end up in jail at the end, thanks to the New York Times. And Nast had a lot of impact there. I think he did over 130 caricatures, so he did not let go. He kept bringing this issue back. He got threats as well. So people working for the target for Mr. Tweed tried to silence him and offered him also, he managed to negotiate. He wanted to see, not to accept the money, to see how far he could go. $500,000 was offered for him to shut up. Or no, it was recommended he take a vacation in Europe. So bye-bye, don't come back. And also it was interesting, Tweed was saying that he hated these caricatures. Why? Because there was a lot of criticism also in the press, but he said, my constituency, not all of them can read, but most of them can identify a caricature, which also shows the means how you transmit something can be important. Now, we heard before that, well, there is still a difference. There it was about exposing corruption. Here it's about televangelist. Does the court make a distinction, saying, well, in a way, this caricature is less worthy or so. Would you make a distinction if you were a judge? Saying, I can well imagine here it's about controlling power, someone in a public function, etc. But this other guy, well.
Yeah, I think the court does kind of say that this advertisement is different. But from what I understand of Falwell's place in like U.S. history is that he really was like a public figure advocating like really conservative positions. And while this is an ad in a magazine and not a political cartoon per se, there's like also kind of like a political angle to it, trying to like question the moral superiority that this person presents in the public. And the court tries to say that essentially that it's maybe different but related, and once you start trying to determine what the bounds of what outrageous means, then that would kind of open the gates for all political cartoons to be subject to being struck down.
So you have summarized it really well. I think we have a line drawing problem and a double line drawing problem. The court does say that this cartoon is a bit a distant cousin of the great political cartoons. It doesn't say it's the greatest thing ever produced. But as you say, there is a political component in a way. So the court sticks more to the criteria, is the person a public figure? And doesn't try to determine what degree of, I would say, this political component has to have. It's a bit similar with defamation, that nowadays you focus on, is it a public figure? We've also seen in a different context, for example, when we discussed the Canadian case on defamation, that courts, by the way, tend to define public speech on a matter of public interest quite broadly. So it's not just about politicians. And as you said, it's still someone who supports political candidates, who has certain views on morality, etc. And we can imagine, particularly in today's context, that these voices also do have an impact, shape public opinion. So the court does not make any distinction, saying the good caricatures, the bad ones, the mediocre ones. It just says, okay, it's a public figure. We don't draw lines. And the other question then is, you could still say, well, public figures have to tolerate more criticism than others, but not anything goes. So the question is, and this is what Falwell was advocating, he said, look, at some point there must be a line in the sand. If it gets particularly outrageous, then freedom of speech has to yield. What was the court's argument on that?
Well,
Good.
it kind of said that just calling it outrageous is a bit vague, really, and it kind of means it can be really subjective. And so just labeling something as outrageous for one person might just feel normal to another person, so it opens up the courts to kind of say, well, argue, well, anything's outrageous, what actually, constitutes this whole act of malice? Is it fact, or is it just, someone just found it offensive and other people wouldn't?
So I think that's what the court points to. It's the subjectivity of saying it's not clear what does it mean outrageous. It might depend, and we mustn't forget it's a trial by a jury in this case. So it will depend a lot on the jury, how they view the situation. Maybe there's generational differences. Maybe we are, for example, less sensitive to something like that than I don't know, people who are older, etc. So the court finds this is not a principled distinction. It will be basically dependent on the jury, etc. And what is the risk? We return to the chilling effect. The caricaturist will say, well, I don't know. Will they find that too outrageous, particularly outrageous? So I'd rather not publish. So the rationale is really very similar to New York Times versus Sullivan. Again, it's about the chilling effect, and you have it on page 200, where basically the court talks about the inherent subjectiveness. It will depend on the juror's tastes and views, and there is no really principled standard. So if I return to my question to you, if you write a legal opinion, you return to President Trump, you're hired. He asks you, what are my chances of getting something? It may not stop him from suing the press for, huge, etc. amounts and say, well, a lawsuit is already pressure and creates legal fees, but the outcome, what will you tell him? Has he got a chance of getting something?
No, because I feel like it's not like a statement of factual facts, because you can tell he's not actually a pig of your life, or like he's not got the physical characteristics like that. So you can't prove statements made with actual facts or actual malice.
So I think it would be hard here again to say it's a factual allegation. It's more an opinion, a criticism. And if we apply Hustler magazine, I think there is no line in the sand. The whole idea is, well, you're a public figure. We can't say if something is particularly outrageous or not, far too subjective, so you get away with it. Now, maybe I find that the judgment is, in certain ways, a little bit confusing when it talks about New York Times, because in a way it gives the impression that it says, the court basically says, you see it on page 201, that public figures and public officials may not recover for the tort of intentional infliction of emotional distress, etc., without showing in addition that the publication contains a false statement of fact which was made with actual malice. Why do I think this is a bit confusing? Because if you have false statements of facts and actual malice, you will sue for defamation. You will not sue for emotional distress. And if you sue for emotional distress, the conditions for the outlined will not be fulfilled because you will not have statements of facts. And there was basically a concurring opinion by one judge who basically said, well, I don't really understand why we mobilize New York Times here. It would be clearer to say politicians can recover for defamation if there are false allegations of fact, but you have to show actual malice. New York Times makes it really hard. If it's not factual statements, if it's ridiculing you, making fun of you, if it's a caricature, there is no line in the sand. Then basically we don't even have to ask, is there actual malice or whatever, because it won't be a statement of fact. You will not get anywhere. Any questions on particularly the last aspect with New York Times, etc.? Clear to everyone? So here, really, there is no line in the sand. In the legal opinion, you would write, well, according to the Supreme Court, if it's not a factual allegation and the person is a public figure, you will not be able to get anything for emotional distress. It doesn't matter how shocking, we may find this is. Question to you: what do you think about this approach? Convinced? Not convinced? If you were on the Supreme Court of your home jurisdiction, would you reason in the same way? What would be your take on it? Shall we first talk about Strauss and then maybe see what you find is more convincing? So we have here a case against Strauss, was Prime Minister of Bavaria. He was quite often portrayed as a pig, or caricaturists also made quite a bit of fun of him because of his facial features. Now, there was a whole series of caricatures where he was portrayed as a pig having sexual intercourse with other pigs. And it was a student who sent me after the course these pictures. And I'm not sure how easy they are to find because it was considered as infringing his personality rights. So just to give you an idea about what type of caricatures were at issue. Now, if we compare Strauss and the Falwell case, if we just look at the caricatures, which one would you think you would have is more worthy of protection? Do you see differences, or would you say it's actually the same, more or less?
I think that the case in the United States is probably more controversial because it gives the idea that the person is actually telling you the story, since it's supposed to be an interview. So this is clearly a way of, for sure, giving some type of embarrassment towards the person, but the other one can also be maybe classified like if someone is reading it without any clue of what it's happening there, they might think it's some real interview or something like that.
Do you think it could still mislead people, despite the disclaimer saying it's,
I think so, because like this kind of art is always used for some type of manifestation.
So you would say first one, okay, risk of at least some readers might take it seriously. Right? Any other ideas on these caricatures? Because we may also have different angles, different sensitivities when it comes to comparing Strauss and Falwell.
You could argue that they contribute to the public debate of what you can say, because they clearly show this whole debate of what's this auch nach Karlsruhe. This clearly needs to test the limit of what
Oh, sorry, I'm just trying to see if I can.
it's a little bit like
A vicious circle saying we think.
because they want to test the limit of what they're able to say, contribute by doing so to the public debate, but at the same time.
So you say actually that caricature also is a debate about what can we get away with, what is admissible in public discourse. Or,
Only in this, otherwise they don't really have so much.
and what was the caricature probably? What were they trying to show with? There was also other caricatures where he was shown as basically having intercourse with pigs, which were wearing the judicial robe. Was that one? I think that was supposed to be more of a justice person. We talked before about whether it's political or not. Would you say one was more political than the other?
Yes, I think these cartoons are more political than the ones in the United States. The ones in the United States are more advertisement that use a public figure for its purposes. But here there's more political criticism, perhaps on the separation of powers, I think. I'm not sure. Definitely has more political sense.
So you could say the second caricature in Strauss, it's certainly also a criticism of someone who is prime minister of a land, and there were the allegations that he somehow interfered with justice, so that's quite a serious allegation. We can link it to the separation of power. Maybe for the Falwell case, I don't think anyone would have taken it as an advertisement for Campari. I think it was also making fun of him. There was, you mentioned it, this political, there was an underlying political message. We criticize someone who always takes the moral high ground, preaches conservative values. But I would also say this one is more political, certainly. Do some people find it more shocking? Say, well, that's worse than the Campari ad, or same?
Maybe the Campari one could be considered a little bit more outrageous for the fact that it's talking about, if I'm not wrong, his mother. So the fact of including like the family member could make it more of a personal attack rather than a political discourse.
So you're saying we include the mom, and that makes it particularly, in a way, we have a hand here and then you.
Yeah, I think I agree with her because I think that this is all based on political assumptions, while the other one is supposed to make him embarrassed towards something that's like personal. So I think this is kind of a fair fight, while the other one is more like just banter.
And also, like, on the first one, the Comparative one, he's a public figure. So, okay, he cannot complain because he's a public figure and he has not the right, but he might be judged or given a negative point of view regarding him. But the mom, she's not. So she doesn't have reason why to be included in the...
It gives me an idea. They should have sued on behalf of the mother. Maybe that would have been interesting because she's not a public figure. Would they say she becomes an involuntary public figure? It's just I don't know. But yeah, it's an interesting. I have never thought of that one. You were raising your hand as well.
I was thinking that I don't find either particularly shocking, and maybe that's also contemporary taste. I don't think either are that shocking. But I also feel like part of the reason it's not shocking to me is that who they're targeted at is generally powerful white men. I feel like when they're depicted in negative ways, I'm kind of like, oh yeah. But I'm just thinking about if this was depicted towards even like a powerful black woman in the US, I would be really uncomfortable if she was depicted as an animal or in a really negative way, even if I didn't agree with her. So I feel like, and that's partly historical because of the way that like racialized people are often depicted as animals in racist caricatures and things like this. And so, I don't know, in terms of like drawing a line where it's just, can be applied to everyone, it's like, I want to be okay with this because I like who it's targeting in a way. But if I was on the other side, I don't think I would, so that's all I wanted to add.
It's interesting what you said because I think it's a good test sometimes to ask yourselves. I understand completely the argument. I think that's relatively also, there's some objective element to say if you have people who were marginalized in society and they were often shown slaves and black people like dehumanized, that's then much worse. But it can be a good exercise if I showed you Trump. It's not my business if you like or dislike Trump. I would assume that not everyone's a fan. Let's put somewhere there who you're a fan of and see. That can be sometimes a good test and think, would I actually still think the same? It's the same when we discussed issues like subversive speech, where people might say, well, what about in an armed conflict also you might have, not joining the war, you might have more or less sympathy with that statement if you think it's a good cause or not. So, and you also said, well, it's not shocking to you. I think Strauss is a bit older case. It does make a difference also. So you could maybe argue to defend the opposite point of view that Strauss is more explicit. Not sure everyone will read the Campari ad in detail, etc. There is no and there's no dehumanization showing him as an animal. But the aim of this little discussion was not to say one or the other is right, but just to show that also we can have different interpretations and sensitivities, how we read a cartoon, what is the message portrayed or so. So let's look at what the German Constitutional Court did with this caricature. Did the court also basically say, or did the court raise this issue that it may be hard to draw a line with what is, what goes too far, what would still be acceptable, and so on? It's subjective, the US Supreme Court says. What does the German Constitutional Court tell us about this?
It appears that the depiction of like dignity and the core of intimate life that deserves to be protected. They seem to say that caricatures that that it really is like the sexual conduct that crosses the line and tips the scales in favor of protecting the right to dignity instead of the right to expression.
So the court refers here to its dignity, the concept the court relies on, saying, well, you can make fun. So there is a passage where they say, we are aware that caricatures are often here, it's a form of expression which exaggerates, etc. And they also say how to interpret a caricature. You have to distinguish the form and try and then find the content, etc. But they say here the line in the sand has been crossed, and this line in the sand is human dignity. So they do make a distinction between saying you can have, and that's quite a classic conflict, a conflict between freedom of expression and general personality rights. But within general personality rights, the core is human dignity. So there will be a line in the sand where the court says, here you touch upon human dignity. Then obviously we have the question, when is it about human dignity and when is it not about human dignity? And you mentioned that the court said because it's about sexual conduct, that is a problem. So they basically refer to the fact also that sexual relations are basically, in a way, it's intimate, that makes it also touch upon human dignity. Was there another element?
But from the court, the fact that it was art, that's why it had to be protected.
So basically, you do have in the German constitution a special protection of art. It's one form of communication. So but that it wasn't the reason then to say there is no violation. The court still felt even for artistic freedom, if you touch upon human dignity, you've gone too far. Let's take again the Trump caricature. Let's look at this one. Do you think the German Constitutional Court would say this is dehumanizing Trump and therefore it's against human dignity?
I'm pretty sure they would, because the court said it's plainly intended as an attack on the personal dignity. So if there's no other message except for showing that someone is a pig,
so you think it would be against human dignity? I'm not sure, but we'll reach that. Yes.
I have a question, because in the case of Trump, there are some sex scandals that were confirmed, and he was judged by that. So isn't that also a statement of fact? So should it be questioned if it's a fact? And how it would be treated, that's so, because it's not an assumption or an opinion.
I think it's very hard to give a general answer without seeing the caricature. So this one, it's true that there have been obviously scandals, etc., linked to him and sex tapes, but I wouldn't read this as a factual, as a wrong allegation. It's a question, what did the caricaturist want with this one cartoon? Does anyone interpret it as a statement of fact which could be challenged as defamatory?
But the question is also if it is a fact, if he was found guilty for something like that, can it still be used in court to defend him? Because if it's a fact, why shouldn't I talk about it?
Okay, I see the argument. I think probably a court would, in the US we know you get away with it anyway, right? But otherwise the European Court sometimes also says, I think, in a way, if you're a president talking about pussy grabbing and whatever, well, maybe you would also assume you won't be particularly sensitive then when it relates. I think courts would take that into account. Sometimes they also refer to the fact if you provoke, you're very provocative in your statements, you have to take more criticism. I have in mind a case where someone had very strong anti-LGBTIQ statements, a politician, and someone called him politically bankrupt or so, cerebrally, mentally bankrupt, and the court said, well, if you have such statements, you have to expect people will fight back. You could also say, well, if there are some factual elements which have been proven, then that should play a role. But I think it's hard to give general answers. It will also depend which court. We know in the US you get away with it. The German Constitutional Court, a good question. We now use Trump as a pig who has sexual intercourse with whoever. Would that have changed something? I'm not so sure. I don't know. But why I chose this picture also, is it good enough to say if you draw someone as an animal, it's dehumanization and therefore against human dignity?
I think in the case they also argue that no, because sometimes it's just, so to say, joking with the facial or like physical traits of a person, and it is not really like meant to achieve anything political. I think it's on page 206. Where they say that sometimes it is okay to depict people as animals if there's not like a deeper, like for example, sexual or bestial background to the picture.
So indeed, the court does say it's not enough just to draw someone as an animal. If it's just exploiting the facial features, and that's what often happens. You draw someone, I don't know, you think he looks like a camel, or what do I know? Even though I get the impression pigs are a bit overrepresented in caricatures. Dogs, there was also controversial caricatures, often dogs licking someone's boots or things like that. But the court basically says what is bad here. So we had the sexual component, and also the intention is to show that he has marked bestial characteristics and behaves accordingly. And then comes the sexual conduct. As I understand the court, it's also to say, well, it's also to show that he acts like an animal, driven by instinct. He doesn't really control himself. He will just, go for it. So that is the dehumanization. It's not enough just to say it's the facial features. That's why I'm not sure that such a caricature, which usually just shows the face as a pig, would even if may be enough. It's true. I don't know enough about. I know that Muslims don't eat pork. Does it mean that generally they would consider it worse to be portrayed as a pig than another animal? That I can't judge. But obviously, you will always have a context, cultural, sociological context, which may play a role. Here, to return to Strauss' caricature, I think it's really important to see that the court does have a line in the sand. It's human dignity, and it links dignity to dehumanization and intimate sexual conduct. So basically the idea that Strauss is shown as an animal driven by instinct, acting like a beast, and so on, is for the court a clear sign that human dignity has been here infringed. And you can see that there's no mention at all about the difficulty of line drawing or saying this is subjective. The court tries to give here some guidance. Also important, once it is about human dignity, the court will not accept balancing. It will not balance, on the one hand, freedom of expression against human dignity, because human dignity, the court says, is also the highest value in the German constitutional order. And page 207, it basically says that human dignity, when it's about human dignity, this limitation works absolutely, absolutely without the possibility of a balancing of interests. So that's an important point to remember if you have to compare also the methodologies of the courts. Neither court actually does a balancing here. The US court basically says it's too subjective. If it's a politician, a public figure, it's freedom of expression which prevails. The German Constitutional Court says if it's bad enough to infringe human dignity, we will not balance. So this led some commentators also to say, well, maybe it's also a reflection of different constitutional values. Liberty in the US, whereas human dignity is the highest value in Germany. Would be interesting. Obviously, case law can also evolve. And I would just like to mention before we have a break, because you mentioned before, if it were, for example, a black woman or so, you may find things are different. There's a case by the European Court of Human Rights which basically showed it was someone making political cartoons of the mayor and the other members of his staff, and he was always shown. He was shown as a donkey, and the others were also shown as donkeys, and he was accompanied by a female politician who was basically shown, again, the pig is here, as sow, and sexual attributes. I would say if you saw the drawing, you would think of a prostitute. And the case went up to the European Court of Human Rights, where basically the court felt, well, it was also a criminal conviction that that had gone too far. It basically stated it concluded in favor of freedom of expression, saying it is, political satire. She was not the only one criticized, etc. But the court does at least acknowledge that the stereotypes were unfortunate. And there's quite a long concurring opinion, two concurring opinions, talking about the risk, the fact that the target is a woman, and that there is quite a bit of concern also against the violence against women in politics, that women do get more targeted by different means, be it verbally, physically, etc., as politicians. So it's a question, should we basically find differently if the target is a more vulnerable person? Does that play a role, or should we generally say, well, it's political speech and we will not try to limit freedom of expression? Let's have a break and we will continue with blasphemy after the break. We can resume at 17. So we will look now at another category of expression, which I think also is quite connected to offensive speech. It's certainly also statements which can shock people, here mainly because of it making fun of religion. And I think we know that religion has been, and for a long time, a source of contention, and that it's not always easy when you have societies with different religious faiths, basically, that they cohabit peacefully. And I think in the ideal world, we would be able to have discussions about religion in the way as they are described by interfaith dialogue, etc. You know, respectful but still open-minded. This is what you find here, that we should view cultural diversity and also a diversity of religion as a basis for a true and open dialogue, but which is still understanding and respectful. And we should also, through communication, foster knowledge, etc. So this is an ideal, but again, in the real world, people will not always be particularly respectful. They might exaggerate, they might be satirical, etc. And there is also, I think, when we are in such a setting, in a way, you need tolerance on both sides. You would expect that if you express yourself, you could take into account also that something can be hurtful for other people's faith. And at the same time, you have to accept that your faith is not immune from criticism. And very often, when you hold very strong beliefs, the simple fact that the belief is criticized is already considered shocking, etc. So if we assume that you would need some basically restraint on both sides, and the question is where do we put the cursor again? Where do we draw the lines? And then a next question is it up to the law to draw the line, or is it more a question of morality? I have raised this question to make a link to John Stuart Mill. In Mill's text, there's also a passage which we discussed about whether we can regulate not what is said, but how you say it. Should we talk moderately, politely, not exaggerate, not attack someone? And Mill basically says that, in his view, it's a question rather for morality, not for law. So you could still say morally, I think it would be good if not everything you have the right to say. It's good that you say it, morally speaking. But it's not the law which should draw any lines. And Mill gives one reason Mill advances is to say that these lines will be enforced then generally against minorities. So that's just to make a link to a reading you have done. And blasphemous speech in general has been quite controversial. You may remember it started off with the Danish cartoons, then the Charlie Hebdo controversies. It's an issue which comes back. After Charlie Hebdo, there were also within the human rights councils quite a few attempts to sponsor resolutions against defamation of religion. And you could see a strong polarization. On the one hand, the Islamic states who championed the resolution, the generally Western states against it, very critical of this concept of defamation of religions. Now, I think it's interesting to see how does the case law solve this type of tension. And we have had for today different cases, one again taken from the United States, and then two cases decided by the European Court of Human Rights. The European Court there's a whole series of cases on that subject. I have chosen the most recent ones, but it's not the first cases. When we first look at the US case, if someone would like to summarize the case, it's about a film considered sacrilegious, so it should not be shown. Also, you have a preliminary control. What is the main message? What have you retained from the case? Again, imagine you have to write a legal opinion where someone says, based on that case, well, is it compatible with the First Amendment to ban sacrilegious films? Or at what conditions would it be admissible?
So New York had this like ruling that every film that people wanted to show in their state had to be approved and have a license to be shown, and have to be proved to not be sacrilegious or obscene, indecent, immoral, inhuman. And so there was this film that originally was given the license to be shown, and then it was replaced, rescinded the license, and then like they made a complaint against that because of restrictions to freedom of expression.
And what about the outcome? So this first part of the case is very much also about are movies films? I think for you that seems a bit weird. No, you may not even have thought much of the question, but it's true in several jurisdictions, in Switzerland as well, in Germany, there was the question, are movies actually protected expressions? So we can see when there is a new medium also, it raises new questions. And it's a bit, we have read together the Brown case, video games are speech, so movies were earlier on declared speech as well. So I would say that is not the main interest of the case for us. And another point which was raised is also that the First Amendment applies to the states, because when you read the First Amendment, it talks about Congress shall make no laws, so it is applied to the state. That's why they refer to the 14th Amendment. That's this amendment which incorporates this Bill of Rights against the states. But this is not my main focus, so let's assume movies are speech. Obviously, if you ban a speech, this is a limitation of freedom of expression. Is it admissible? Can it be admissible? At what conditions? What's the takeaway from Burstein?
For them, they say sort of two fronts. One is that because it's a censor, it's before the film comes out, it needs to have this approval. That is especially likely to have a chilling effect of this pre-approval that's needed is somehow especially limiting to freedom of expression. And then they basically say to stop people from offending each other based on religious belief, it's kind of impossible not to end up going with the majority point of view, which means you're specifically targeting minority points of view, or they would be less protected. And so all of that sounds way too murky. And so we should call it all freedom of expression and allow the public to decide what they want to see or not, but not have the New York State Board decide what it is that can be shown.
I think you have summarized the case really well. So first point, it's prior restraint. And generally courts consider that if you are prevented even from expressing yourself, from showing a film, that is a very strong interference with freedom of expression. And the Swiss Federal Tribunal, for those who are Swiss, also holds that view. For example, when it comes to, I always read those cases with my bachelor students about, can you prevent to rent, for example, can the municipality refuse to rent a town hall to someone who is, because they think he's racist? And the approach generally is, unless you are really certain, that there will be clear racist statements, you have to let the person speak, and you have the possibility then, to bring criminal charges. So prior restraint is always a strong interference. The European Court says so too. And then comes the other element, but I think probably the court would have found the same had there been a criminal conviction, I would expect, but certainly it's strong interference. And then that's where I see a parallel with the Hassler case. Even Burstein is much older. They basically say sacrilegious, what is this? Who will define what is sacrilegious? It's very broad, very vague, and at the end of the day, well, these poor judges, how will they determine what is sacrilegious? Obviously, and here you can make a link to Mill, this will rather favor, I would say, the majority religions. The minority no one will care much about, and so too vague, it's like saying what is particularly outrageous, we don't know. So you have here the sentence saying it's not just a narrow expression, it's a broad and all-inclusive definition of sacrilegious. The censor is set adrift upon a boundless sea amid a myriad of conflicting currents of religious views, with no charts but those provided by the most vocal and powerful orthodoxies. So we will side with the majority, with what is the mainstream. And further down, the court then basically says there is an inevitable tendency to ban the expression of unpopular sentiments sacred to a religious minority. So those who will be basically, the standards won't be applied in a fair way. Also interesting further down that the court says, anyway, there is no legitimate interest in protecting any or all religions from views distasteful to them. Would you agree with that? To say there is no legitimate interest, to say, well, we should protect people from being hurt in their religion or not? And the court adds, it's not the business of government to protect one group against, being hurt by another. Would you agree with that? Not agree? Would the European Court of Human Rights agree based on what you've read?
However, we don't find this value within the U.S. Constitution, so maybe it's for that it doesn't consider it as a legitimate interest to be protected.
So clearly we will see there is a difference, that the European Court actually finds it is a legitimate interest to protect people against being offended, and the US Supreme Court sees it differently. Well, I'm not entirely sure whether we can say, religious tolerance wouldn't be a value in the US. Maybe I would probably say, I don't know what you would say on that.
I mean, so I've been in France for a long time, and this idea of what is the US vision of freedom of religion versus laïcité in France
very different.
Is very, very different. And so the very short version that I've boiled it down to is in the US, you're allowed to scream as loud as you want about whatever religion you want, and that is protected. Whereas in France, laïcité means the public square is neutral. The public square, you're not allowed to scream about your religion. It needs to be something that is like this still water, and then in your own home you can practice whatever you want. And your screaming, in fact, interferes with the still water of the public square.
And probably the US, are there other people from the US? The AV as well?
Yeah, when I think about freedom of religion in the United States, what comes to mind the most is religious discrimination in the workplace or at retailers. So speech is given a ton of protection in the U.S., but there is protection of religion in the workplace.
And probably when it comes to speech, the approach would be to say, well, tolerance means everyone can put out their view, however crazy it is, however distasteful it might be, and the others have to bear it. So it's a different, it's not the idea you have to basically exercise self-restraint by the law. The law imposes limits, how far you can criticize religion.
Yeah, I think there's a difference between saying something in a public square in the U.S. and, for example, if you bring speech against a religion within a workplace directed towards somebody, that speech could be a part of a harassment claim. And so expression could be like indirectly limited through like harassment law in specific
in certain settings, right? So and I think where maybe there's also a difference in perception that the court basically says, well, it's not our role. Of course, people should be maybe tolerant, but it's not of our role to protect here. It's maybe also this idea of fundamental rights are more of a shield against state action. But if the problem is mainly, for example, individuals, one individual shouting at another and discrediting the religion, it's not viewed as the state has a duty here. It's the state's business to kind of be the arbitrator between these different factions. So I think that may be relevant as well. So I would also make a link to the fact fundamental rights are more shields. It's not in a way a mandate to go and protect one group against another. And just that's what I wanted to add. That brought to the discussion we're having made me think of an article by Robert Post, who's a very well-known free speech scholar in the US, who basically says because we are such a multicultural society, it's extremely difficult to say what is the right, how should people talk. It's virtually impossible to lay down standards, so there is no standard. You might agree or disagree with it, but it shows this perspective of saying, well, tolerance in a way means that everyone can say more or less everything, and we don't police where we have crossed a line. So just just to wrap up on Burstein, I would say we're in a similar situation as with regard to offensive speech. There doesn't seem to be a clear line in the sand. It's a subjective standard. There will be a chilling effect. There is the risk. It is enforced to the detriment of religious minorities, and the court considers it's not its responsibility or its business to protect one group against another. Now, if we look at the European Court of Human Rights, this ES case, maybe one question: would you have found like the court, or would you have reasoned differently? It's a case which was quite a lot. There was quite a lot of commentary about it, and commentators not all agreed with the court. So whatever position you take, you will find someone in scholarship who would back it. Anyone wants to express their point of view? Or do we first need to summarize what happened? So we have this woman calling herself a supposed expert on Islam, giving a seminar, seminar sponsored by the right-wing party in Austria. I think it was quite foreseeable what you would get, in such a seminar. 30 people attended. It was publicly advertised. What did she say? Why was she basically then prosecuted?
That Mohammed was a pedophile, basically, because he had been married to Aisha, if I'm not wrong, was her name, when she was 6 years old, and then consummated by the time she was 9. Reason why he was considered a pedophile, and anyone who would follow his doctrine would be venerating a person who wasn't necessarily a good example.
So basically the statement she made was to say that it's problematic that Muhammad is glorified as the ideal man, and Muslims tend to emulate him. And then she says, well, he is a pedophile, and because he married a minor, Aisha apparently, according to some sources, she was 6 years old, marriage consummated at the age of 9. Now, we can very well imagine that this is extremely hurtful and shocking for the Muslim community. Now, it was interesting to see that domestic courts hesitated. First, there were charges brought under hate speech, and then they revised the charge, and it was for this domestic provision, which is something like, it targets blasphemous speech. Would anyone say it's hate speech? Or could anyone relate to this argument it's a form of hate speech? The courts hesitated. So. If you had to construe an argument, say it's a form of hate speech, do you think it's totally hopeless, or are there some elements you could raise? Sometimes it's not, some cases are very clear, but sometimes the line is not as obvious.
I mean, I think it's tricky with the idea that, like, she is insulting Muhammad, who is not around to be offended. So then all of the people who believe in him and follow him could be offended, but she's not inciting violence against them in this particular instance. She, you know, like, I agree with the court that it would be tricky to bring hate speech here.
So you say she mainly targets Muhammad, who's not alive anymore, etc. So it's more shocking to Muslims. It doesn't incite violence against them.
But on the other side, she also says we have huge problems with that today, that Muslims get into conflict with democracy and our value system. So it might be possible to sort of find an argument against this angle that this generalization is against the Muslim group.
So I also had underlined this sentence on saying we have a big problem of Muslims and democracy. So you could say it's certainly a negative stereotyping. All Muslims, they all emulate Muhammad. It's a form of racism, Islamophobia, which is, I would say, what you link it to the culture. It's not to say, you know, there's biological differences, but it's the cultural incompatibility. This Islam per se and the Muslims are not compatible with our democratic values, etc. The question is, would that be bad enough, you know, for a criminal conviction? Because for hate speech, generally, the criminal conviction, you may have to say, well, a lot of jurisdictions might say that it has to be more direct, more explicit, etc. But certainly there is a racist message sent, and it would be interesting what, for example, ICERT would say about that. It's the Committee on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination. They tend to have a broader vision of hate speech. There's one case against Germany about a politician who had a lot of statements were against mainly the Turkish community, and he made a distinction between the intelligent immigrants, I let you guess who those might be, and then the less intelligent one who kind of are useless, don't work, lazy, reproduce a bit like rabbits. He didn't put it that way, but you could read it in there, where ICERT felt, well, that is actually, you know, the German authorities should have done something against that speech. So I think why here the Austrian authorities hesitated is the threshold reached for hate speech, but certainly there is stereotyping in there, which may be even more problematic than the question. So the courts looked at it then under the blasphemous speech, so it's more, this time it's less about, the main focus is about the fact that it hurts people who are Muslims, they will be deeply shocked, etc. I think nowadays for us it's easier to see why would we, you know, limit hate speech. What's the reason? Why would we have blasphemy laws according to the court as well? For those who are Swiss, I don't know, do you know that we have a criminal law provision like this as well? It's Article 261 of the Swiss Criminal Code, the provision just preceding the anti-hate speech norm. I think it hasn't been used since the 40s, so it still exists in the criminal code, but there are actually no cases brought. So. Why would you say we limit here speech on? What's the rationale? Handicide speech which shocks, disturbs is protected. Coming from, I haven't heard.
I'm sorry. I'm coming from a social science background.
Okay.
So what I realized as a student coming from a multicultural and multi-ethnic society, the law comes later because social norms and when you're releasing a statement that very sensitive for religion things, every system in a country, they have to be cautious about the things. Because one speech may occur, cause to make a war or conflict between communities. That's why, as I do remember in that genocidal denial case, Pinkett was
Perinchek, yeah.
yes, Pinkett was. In that case, also they have mentioned, sometimes it's better to not to talk about the things genocide or whatever the things, because it's motivate people to make conflicts again and again. So it's better sometimes to not to talk about the things.
So I think maybe what you're saying, one argument, that's a standard argument, the court mentions this as well, could be religious peace. To say, depending on the context, in certain contexts, I mean, things can just blow up. If you think of Northern Ireland, when the tensions were very strong, Catholics, Protestants, there was already enough just to say one wants to make a march, through a certain area, etc. If you read the Swiss case law, it's quite interesting. At the very old case law, tensions in Switzerland between Catholics and Protestants were very strong. Geneva, for a long time, had a total ban on religious processions, saying, well, it's too controversial. The Swiss Federal Tribunal then said in 1981, I think it was, that now, things have evolved and it's not a concrete risk anymore. So you could say we have to put in place some limits, sometimes just for public religious peace, so also secure people's security, public order. But then you can make a contextual argument and say it will depend where, etc. Is there a concrete risk? We discussed that issue with incitement to violence, with subversive speech. You should maybe have a look at the context. So if it's not about, if we say now, let's assume, we don't have a big problem about religious peace. Could you think of another reason why you should limit speech like that? What does the court say about it?
That the state has the responsibility to guarantee the peaceful exercise of freedom of thought, conscience, and religion. So that's why they are putting a limit there.
So it's true that the court refers to Article 9 of the European Convention, freedom of religion, and says, well, the state, and here comes this idea, the state has to protect. Okay, the state can't say it's not my business. The state is here to protect, you say, the free also exercise of religion. Well, is the free exercise of religion in any way interfered with here?
Maybe it can be interfered with in the future if you create, by saying things like this, an atmosphere of intolerance against one particular religion, and then this intolerance is so widespread in society that it's impossible for someone to really go to a church or a mosque or something because someone might attack you.
So you're saying maybe indirectly, we can see very clear cases. Imagine you're a religious minority, you want to go to your church and you're being attacked. There are cases physically attacked where the court said the police has the duty to make sure you can exercise your religion. We are not in such a direct setting. So you're saying we could build an indirect argument that maybe, such statements will create a climate of intolerance where you will not feel at ease saying, well, I'm Muslim, I'm exercising my faith if I'm being linked to pedophilia and whatever.
I think this is not a strong argument because it is so far in the future and it is like a potential restriction that might happen in the future. And the whole idea, I believe, is to let freedom of speech be intact, to let people say what they want in order to find the truth, going back to Mill. And I think this is not an immediate threat. It's something that is presupposed. It's a maybe happening or maybe not. But currently, this woman saying what she said to 30 people, I don't think it could be said that she was restricting anyone's right to practice their religion.
So I think you can take two different lines of arguments. One argument would be, and some scholars have said, the first case it was interesting wasn't against Islam. It was a film being shown in Tyrol. Tyrol is a Catholic region. An alternative cinema wanted to show a film where I think Jesus was shown as an imbecile and whatever, very offensive to the Christian religion, and the court there basically said, well, freedom of religion entails the right not to be gratuitously offended in your religious feelings. So it's not just about future intolerance, etc., but you're protected against being gratuitously offended. That's what the court repeats, that standard in this case. I'll show it to you in a second. So basically, some commentators have said it should not be. It's a free expression case. Freedom of religion does not give you the right not to be gratuitously offended. There the court interpreted these positive duties, protect freedom of religion, too far. We can relate to the fact that you will protect people against physical attacks, etc. And interesting, that case was about the majority religion. I don't think that anyone in Tyrol will now say, I'm feeling afraid to be a Catholic because, an alternative cinema shows a film like that. The setting here is different because it's a religious minority. That's also a question we can ask ourselves. Does it matter if you attack the minority or the majority phase? Then the other argument, I'll give you the floor straight away, can be made. We accept this. There is the right not to be gratuitously offended, but then we have to look at proportionality. And there it would typically play a role, how many people, were informed, etc. I think Otto Preminger Institute, the Tyrol case, was maybe clearer, where I would not have endorsed the court's reasoning. It's an alternative cinema. I don't think the risk would be that, people go there who are very strong believers. Or you could even imagine, say, we just warn people. We say, the trigger warning, if you might be shocked, etc. Here it was, so proportionality would be the other element. Now, when we look at the reasoning the court had in this case, what did it do about proportionality? Did the court say, well, it was only 30 people, so there could have been other arguments advanced in favor of saying it's
I think it's hard because they say, well, they did do a balancing act between this Article 9 religion and Article 9 expression. Because the applicant argued that she contributed to public debate, and so, aim to make objective statements and debate, and that's her freedom of expression. But then the court argued that because these seminars were open to the public, it wasn't a kind of a closed space, like anyone could have walked in and heard these statements, and then they also were counted as derogatory value judgments, so aiming to degrade a religion. So that's when it passed this kind of permissible limits on the protecting the freedom of religion more than freedom of expression because of the nature of who could access the statements and the exact kind of the words and the intent behind the statements to be derogatory.
So clearly the court does say, in a way, there is a balancing act. It does not pay much attention to the fact that it was actually relatively, it's a closed setting. Yes, everyone could have walked in, but there were 30 people. A journalist, it was actually a journalist who brought the case. Well, also, you may have noticed the court, and I think this explains also the court's reasoning, it leaves a wide margin of appreciation to the nation states. The court basically says, well, the nation states know better. This is a very sensitive issue, so the court just takes a bit of a hands-off approach and says, well, the domestic authorities know better, how to basically here do the balancing process. So when you look at the case, the margin. First, maybe about the legitimate aim. It's paragraph 41. You can see that the court refers to religious peace and also the right of others, saying here being to be protected protecting religious feelings is a legitimate ground of limiting freedom of expression. And in paragraph 42, the court then refers to Article 9. So the religious feelings are protected by freedom of religion. So it's an interpretation of freedom of religion as protecting you against attacks in your religious feelings. And you will find on page 218, the court summarizes its case law and basically says the line in the sand is, it can't be, as 218, first line on the page, gratuitously offensive. And here we have an improper or even abusive attack on an object of religious veneration. So the court again tries to veer back to line drawing. We can either say, it's too hard to draw a line. That's the American approach. What is sacrilegious? It's so subjective. Let's not draw a line. The European court's line in the sand is if it's gratuitously offensive, if it's an improper attack or abusive attack on an object of religious veneration, the court considers that then it's a violation of tolerance. So tolerance means also self-restraint. Don't go, and provoke people and hurt them in their religious feelings. And people who generally, so there's also, it's controversial. Scholars take different positions. Some say, well, we should stick to handicide if it's just offensive speech. This speech should not be limited. And others say, well, but religion is a bit special. It's so close to your personality that such attacks are really different from generally offensive speech. But important for the court, there is a line in the sand, or it is gratuitously offensive speech. And then paragraph 44, the court talks about a wide margin of appreciation, also in paragraph 50. It's a particularly sensitive nature. The situation will differ from one country to the other, etc. So the national authorities are in a better position to evaluate which statements should be restricted and which ones should be allowed. And also this idea you find in paragraph 52 that it's a violation of this, I would say, this idea of tolerance to just go ahead and insult others in their religion. So we can see here quite a different approach again to the United States. Now, there was still, if I had to defend the author of these statements, I have no sympathy for the statements, but I think you can still make some claim. What about the statements that Mohammed was a pedophile? Why would you say that went too far?
More a question. That's something that I highlighted and I was kind of confused when I read it. It's that the court basically says that the problem is not the alleged conduct which took place 1,000 years ago, but the fact that she called him a pedophile without proof of him actually being a pedophile.
So the question is, what is pedophilia according to the court?
Yeah, they define it, according to me, really weirdly, because if I understand correctly, they are saying that this is not necessarily correct, as although he married a child, pedophilia means having a primary sexual interest in children's bodies, and the Prophet continued to be married with this girl up until his death when she was already over 18.
So I think what you're saying is, in a way, probably if I ask people in the streets what is a pedophile, a lot of people will probably say someone who has sex with children. And what the court says here, no, and the court might be right from a strict definitional point of view. That pedophilia probably, it's like someone who is, let's say, So what I want to, it's more a sexual attraction you have, someone who has attractions to children. It's not the fact you have sex with a child, but the fact you are sexually attracted to children. So it's, that is for the court a difference. The other claim, the other argument the court makes is to say it was totally decontextualized. At the time, child marriage was something common. So you portray him as, you know, someone who sexually, in a way sexually is deviant. A lot of people consider, I mean, nowadays pedophilia is clearly a criminal offense, and people will say that is in a way a deviant, sexual preference. So,
But that was my question. Why was it so necessary to provide evidence that his primary sexual interest had been because she hadn't reached the age of puberty? Like, what changed? What difference did it make if they confirmed or denied that information? Like, the statement would have still be considered an act against or disrespect to a religion, wouldn't it be?
I think it would have still been, the court then makes a difference between value judgments, but they should have some factual basis. So I think the court would have maybe said, yes, it's hurtful, but if we have clear, or we have enough textual evidence saying that the prophet actually systematically, targeted or wanted to have sex with small children, then we could somehow understand this charge of pedophilia. It might have been still hurtful, but there would have been more factual basis to it. So I think if you hear
just a little bit of like, it's almost bordering on defamation of this idea of like, if she was saying something about him and it was true, then that's more protected. But because we have made the decision that sleeping with children is not the definition of pedophilia, calling him a pedophile therefore doesn't call it. Like, that's untrue. And so that becomes then more...
Oh, it hasn't got any no factual basis.
It brings less things of value to the discussion.
And I think you may argue, if I had to defend her, I would say, look, most people will not talk, may not be aware of this scientific definition of pedophilia, and a lot of people will make the shortcut, sex with children equals pedophilia. Well, maybe she should have been got away with that, even if I have no sympathy whatsoever with the statements. But I think that's a line of defense you could have taken. And the court did not take that. He was much more, I mean, it's also the wide margin of appreciation, etc. Yeah.
Can she argue that if there is sexual attraction, there is sex most of the times, and if there is sex, then there was some kind of sexual.
But I think what the court means is that pedophilia is really, you will basically systematically will be attracted by children, not by adults. So that's why the court says, well, he had other wives. I mean, there's no basis to show that he was particularly attracted to children. Well,
I find this really problematic because if today someone married a child and had sex with them, there would be no question that we call them pedophile. And this leads into maybe this woman was not aware of the court's definition of pedophilia, because I just did a quick Google search and...
What did you find about it?
Yeah, just a second. So it says, in which an adult or adolescent experiences a sexual attraction to pedophilia. Like, how could she foresee that this would be so controversial when in the average person's mind,